Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Phil Ryan. I'm Tricycle's executive editor, and I'm pleased to be here with you for Dark Meditation, Exploring Inner Space with Lama Justin von Bujdoss. We'll leave time at the end of this hour-long session for questions, and you ask questions by typing into the Q&A session, Q&A tab, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. And we promise to get to as many of these as we can. Today's Zoom session will be recorded, and we will share the replay link in a follow-up email after this event. My guest today is Lama Justin von Bujdoss. Justin is an American Vajrayana Buddhist teacher and writer, and is co-founder, along with Lama Rod Owens, of Bhumisparsha, an experimental Buddhist Sangha. Justin is currently developing the Yangti Yoga Retreat Center. Maybe we'll hear more about this. And is the author of Modern Tantric Buddhism, Authenticity and Embodiment in Dharma Practice, and is also a contributor to Buddhism and Whiteness, Critical Reflections. From 2016 until December 2021, Justin served as the executive director of chaplaincy and staff wellness for the New York City Department of Correction, where he also served as staff chaplain, supervising over 30 other chaplains and leading wellness programming for the staff. Justin also has professional experience in home hospice and hospital settings as a pastoral caregiver. He's currently the chaplain for Hart Island, New York City's public cemetery. This place was much in the news during COVID. If you're a New York resident, I'm sure you've heard about it. And Justin was ordained as a Repa, a lay tantric yogin in the tradition of Milarepa, by His Eminence Gyaltsab Rinpoche, one of the heart sons of His Holiness, the 16th Karmapa. Justin is passionate about helping to create the conditions for authentic, embodied tantric Buddhist spiritual practice in the West, for which we thank him. Welcome, Justin.
Welcome. Thank you, Bill. It's nice to be with you today.
Great to be here with you too. So, Justin, you just wrote about dark meditation in the new issue of Tricycle. Maybe everyone has seen it.
That's right.
Can you describe the practice for us, just to kick things off?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so the practice of dark retreat meditation, or yangti yoga, as it's known more in Sanskrit, and then munsam in Tibetan, is a practice of settling into meditation. There are a number of different forms of this, and really kind of, one of the key features of this is that there's this kind of sensory deprivation with respect to the complete absence of light 24/7, typically, like in a dark retreat setting. So this means one eats in the dark, uses the bathroom in the dark, and these retreats can, under kind of more traditional circumstances, usually take the course of 7 days up to 49 days. But there are cases of great masters of the tradition spending much longer periods of time, in the darkness. Ayu Khandro was one of such a teacher. She was a teacher, one of the teachers of Namkhai Norbu Rinpoche. And then Shukseb from the Lunchen Nyingtik tradition was also, I believe, said to have spent at least about 6 months a year in complete darkness, engaging this kind of practice.
So the story of how you first came across these teachings is pretty fascinating. Can you tell us a bit about that and about the texts that ground the practice?
Yeah, no, thank you. So I first came to, I had heard, as one does, little whispers here and there of this kind of practice being a thing. But it really wasn't until I had connected with one of my teachers, this Tibetan teacher who lived in Sikkim, who basically came down to Sikkim in the late 1930s, showed me this text that contains all the these different kinds of visions that arise, in the practice of dark retreat, and some of these images were used, in the article and Tricycle, and I'd never seen a text like this that it just has, primarily visual depictions of what is seen. And when I met this teacher Putting Rinpoche, when I met him, I had done a retreat of doing 100,000 prostrations at his in this kind of small retreat place in southwestern Sikkim southeastern Sikkim on the border of Bhutan. And as he was showing me around the property, he showed me this box, and he was like, "Oh, this is the box when I die, I want to be put in, and then I'll dissolve into rainbow body," which is also, potentially an outcome, from doing a lot of dark retreat practice. So I learned about it through encountering this text which he gave my Dharma brother Eric and I a copy of, and though he died before he could teach us, and so this led me on this journey to try and connect with somebody who was willing to kind of discuss the nature of the practices, and then ultimately teach them. Much of my early spiritual formation took place in the Karma Kagyu tradition, around which there really isn't that much practice of this these days. And so, I brought this to the previous Boku Rinpoche. I brought this to Gyaltsen Rinpoche, Lama Wangdu Rinpoche, one of my other teachers, and everybody kind of knew what the text was, but some people like Gyaltsen Rinpoche just handed it back with no comment. Boku Rinpoche handed it back and was like, "Oh, this is a very special text. Be careful who you give this to," this kind of thing. Lama Wangdu is like, "Oh, I know this, but it's been such a long time since I've practiced it. I can't really help you." And it wasn't until I connected with Dr. Nita Chinatsang in 2016, I showed him the text, and instantly he was like, "Oh, where did you get this?" And I explained about Putting Rinpoche. It turns out Putting Rinpoche's teacher was Shukseb, who was also one of the teachers of the main teacher, actually, of Dr. Nita's, one of his primary teachers, Ani Gyaltsen, who he studied with in Lhasa. And, at the time he thought this was auspicious because, he had this connection with Shukseb through Ani Gyaltsen. And he was able to confirm the text. And it wasn't until much later during the pandemic that we were able to connect around actually engaging in the practice of dark retreat.
I noticed you say dark retreat. We said dark meditation in the magazine, but really it's more about the retreat experience rather than the meditative experience.
Yeah, this is a good question. It is. There is, so within the practice of entering into a dark retreat, it's not just about being in darkness. It's being, it's being in darkness for a specific amount of time, and then engaging a set of practices, which are, essentially meditation practices. But there's a big difference between being in darkness, let's say for 24 hours versus, 3 days or 4 days, because one of the things that ends up occurring is a lot of visual phenomena and visions begin to arise in the practice. And it depends. I've done 4 of these retreats. I'm doing another one next week, actually. And with the first retreat and the second retreat, the visions took about 2 days to kind of develop. More recently, they happen a little bit more quickly, but it takes a bit of time for the visions to happen, which is why the retreat experience is really important. If one were to spend, if one spends a day, 24 hours in darkness, that can be a very good experience. But what the practice really kind of pushes us towards is basically this kind of sense, or even you could say, as per the tradition, all visual phenomena that we experience in our everyday life, we tend to feel like is coming towards us. So even, looking at these screens, right, the visual content is there, and then it's, I'm basically through the ability to see and my eyeball, I'm experiencing this form, and then this is converted into data through my neurological process, and this is how I know what I'm seeing. In the context of Dzogchen or Hatha yoga, really it's a little bit the opposite. Everything that we see and experience arises from us through our eyes. And so being in complete darkness, or being in this situation where there's the sensory deprivation around light, then the form, right, everything that's experienced through the visual field still occurs, but it is occurring in darkness, again, through our own eyes. And so we are engaging with a whole other set of appearances that become the primary point of the meditation experience.
Yeah, I want to get more into the experience in a bit, but I'm interested in this rumor mill among lamas. It sounded like everyone had heard a bit about this, that it was kind of a legend. Dark retreat is a legend. What is the context for the practice within Vajrayana? You mentioned Dzogchen.
Yeah, so we find this in a few contexts. One of which is Dzogchen, Hatha yoga, and then you also find this though in the practice of Kala Chakra. There is a dark retreat component. I spoke really briefly with Khenpo Rinpoche about this in Bhutan last summer during the Vajrayana conference that happened there, and he confirmed this. And Dr. Nita was with me, and he was also able to confirm this. And then when we look also within the context of in the Karma Kagyu tradition, the 6 yogas of Naropa, there is a reference to practicing in the dark associated with the illusory body yoga practices. And so it's a very kind of interesting line. It's at the end of the instruction. It more or less says, if no experience has happened as a result of this meditation, then go into the darkness and practice there. And then so Jamgon Khantrul Lodro Tai wrote a short dark retreat, a 7-day dark retreat practice that you find in the Rinchen Terdzo. And so, Jamgon Khantrul Lodro Tai's kind of location in all of this was kind of this Nyingma Kagyu hybrid. So there is the existence of it in this setting. And then also in the Yutok Nintik, there is an element of dark retreat practice that's done in association with Tumo. So it exists in all of these places. It is one of the most secret practices, which is why I think there's a lot of kind of speculation around how much is actually even practiced these days. And in fact, at the end of the Vajrayana conference in Bhutan last year, one of the last presentations was on dark retreat, and there was this monastic scholar who was giving a presentation, and he had interviewed a number of people who had done dark retreat in Bhutan, but given the kind of strict nature of secrecy around it, they could neither confirm nor deny any of the details around it. And so while it was an interesting presentation, it was clear that there's not necessarily a lot, maybe in that particular context of kind of anthropological support around it, but it is still practiced.
So you alluded earlier to kind of the sense doors and how we receive impressions. Obviously, with dark meditation, you're not getting anything through your eyes, or are you? Maybe you are. And are your other senses heightened? Do you notice? Does your awareness increase in other areas?
Yeah, so all senses tend to increase in subtlety. So, for example, taste. One eats in the dark, and one's food needs to be prepared by people. And so I found that there's certain things that what I enjoy in everyday life that in dark, the experience of this kind of sensory deprivation are overwhelming, and it's kind of strange, like blackberries, for example. I enjoy them in the lit world. In the dark retreat context, it's like somebody opened a bottle of cheap perfume. It's just very, very, very intense. In
a good way or bad? Intense in a good way or bad way?
They were like cheap perfume in a bad way. Yeah. And then but then I've also had experiences of actually being able to smell the food before it was brought into the building where I was doing retreat. So much like the heightened senses that we find that animals have, sense of smell, this arises. And then hearing. So there was during a 49-day dark retreat, there was a quite a huge thunderstorm that happened, and every time there was the clap of thunder, I felt like a scared animal. It was just so loud, so intense. So in this process, and also actually the amount of food one feels they need to consume also begins to decline as well. So it's not necessarily recommended to kind of reduce consciously fast or things like this, because it is important for our body to be properly nourished and bolstered and supported in this kind of retreat, because these can be really intense retreat experiences given all of the visions that arise. And though at the same time there's kind of like a trackable decrease in need, and part of this also is just because there's not a lot of movement happening necessarily either, right? So one is primarily seated or laying down. There's no walking around. I mean, you can walk around if there's space, but there's no exercise and stuff like this, right? So everything kind of begins to settle quite deeply.
Van Gogh talked about sight as being your eyes being hungry, as being appetitive, and so I guess it makes sense. Your appetites decrease as the stimuli decrease.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, once the visions begin to arise, they can become so incredibly vivid for basically for the entirety of the time that you're awake. So you can see what arises at times varies, but all sorts of animals, or flying through space, or being in a cave, right? And so even though you're in complete darkness, you begin to see this relief of cave walls, different patterns of light, and it's also very fascinating because one's eyes are open, but if you put your hands over your eyes, the visions maintain, they're the same. Or if one takes a meditation shawl and puts it over one's head, you see the same thing. And because of the nature of the vividness of it, there were definitely days when it was time to fall asleep, which no one really knows what time that is, because you also lose your circadian rhythm over time. there can also be the sense of exhaustion just because just so much is produced. And there was a question in the Q&A box that I just want to kind of address about preparation. And so it is important before starting a practice like this to be in a very kind of stable mindset, right? So just given some of my history as a chaplain, for example, this isn't the kind of practice I would do if I was in the process of grieving, like a loss or this kind of thing, just because there's one wants to be able to be as emotionally balanced and stable as possible, as rested as possible. So in one particular way, the preparation for the retreat becomes as much of the practice as the practice of being in the retreat, and then similarly the integration period afterwards, and this kind of attention to really being methodical and relaxed and slow and quiet in the integration back into the lit world, and ultimately most likely our busyness is really important as well.
Can you tell us about your, you mentioned your 49-day retreat, and the preparations are important, and there's probably some hard prerequisites, in fact, to undergo the 49-day experience.
Yeah, so I mean, within the context, so I was doing this in the context of Dzogchen, and so in that particular context, having a stable practice of trekcha, which is sometimes translated as cutting through hardness, which is this a practice of settling into the direct experience of the nature of mind, and beginning to experience the depth of awareness, the nature of thought, the nature of what all experience, visual and through all of our senses becomes a key practice. An equivalent to trekcha is Mahamudra. And so by the time I had entered into my 49-day dark retreat, I had already 20 some odd years of practice of trekcha and Mahamudra. And so there was this stability there that was important. The stability is important also because even in Jamgon Khantrul Lodrotai's short text on for a 7-day dark retreat, he mentions how quote unquote dangerous it is with respect to how vivid the visions become. And I mean, they're so real that it is as if all of this stuff is happening directly in front of you. And the practice of trekcha and or Mahamudra become a really important factor in terms of being able to regard whatever is arising as the nature of one's own mind, or as the nature of the shifting energy that is occurring within the body, right? So that one is able to directly encounter what is happening, but in a way that it is arising and it's also being self-liberated at the same time. And so all of this is to say, for the layperson, so to speak, a solid grounding in meditation is important, but a solid grounding in non-conceptual meditations like Mahamudra and trekcha is important. And then some of the other kind of key factors, making sure one is healthy, taking the time to not jump into this from a super busy, like let's say you have a deadline, with a new issue coming out. Like once all the work is done, it wouldn't be advisable to jump right into a dark retreat. There should be this process of slowing down and settling, and then again, from there, moving into this. And really, actually, the quote unquote, risk factor is one of the reasons for the secrecy, because it's the same way, one wants to make sure that qualified people do whatever kind of work they need to do and have all the qualifications, the very nature of the qualifications might exclude certain people until they become qualified, and then they can enter into it. And so this is the main reason why these are kind of held with some secrecy.
Dark retreats were in the mainstream press recently. Certain celebrity athletes were taking part. We don't know what their preparations were. Let's assume they made their preparations. But what gives a dark retreat this appeal for even non-Buddhists?
Yeah, this is an interesting thing. So it seems that right now, like dark retreat has entered into kind of the kind of much more what do you say, the contemporary spiritual marketplace, along the lines as we've seen, for example, with plant medicines. All of the, plant medicine, I think, is a really good analogy, in the sense that plant medicine, whether it's any kind of thing like ayahuasca or boga or these kinds of things, have a very specific traditional rooting in a set of spiritual practices. And people have been discovering that there is a kind of transformational quality and experience that happens in taking these things. And so now you're also seeing kind of a prevalence of people taking these out of the original context and using them, almost, recreationally. And it is producing an effect. And being in darkness for 4 days or 7 days can produce an effect. But the question becomes, when removed from the centuries-old contemplative context, is this the same kind of experience? And I would venture to guess, if you lack all of the preparation, in the traditional context, it's probably not. It could be beneficial, and also, though, it could be harmful too. And one needs to be careful to make sure that if you're doing this, you have the proper support.
So you mentioned the lit world. I love that phrase, but the electric light and before that gas-powered light obviously changed the human relationship to darkness and night. So is the experience of going into dark meditation, well, it's hard for you to say precisely, but I imagine it's different for a contemporary person versus when it was first developed. They might have had a little more baseline comfort with being in the dark.
Yeah, I think you're probably right about that. I also think somebody existing pre modern era, I would venture to guess, also probably has a better ability to concentrate, because they don't always have this thing to look at whenever they get bored. So even the way that there have been studies done, I think it's on the blue light, right, that comes from some of these screens, and how disruptive it can be to sleep cycles. I remember, it's been a long time since I read anything about this, so I'm not going to be 100% accurate, but that it's advised that people actually don't, look at their screens before going to sleep, because of the effects of this blue light on sleep cycle experiences. So yeah, I think it is a different time. For me, when I engage in a 7-day retreat, I actually try to make it a 9 to 10-day retreat, to give myself some time to kind of titrate down in the darkness. But we could say the darkness and the slowness, right, to kind of settle into that. And then once there's this kind of stabilization, then engaging the practices that happen.
Obviously, visualizations play a huge part in dark retreat. How do you manage that? I guess I'm imagining, you're picking certain times to sit and meditate. You're picking a time to obviously rest and do other things. But are the visualizations? I could see certainly for someone who hasn't prepared, there would be a sense of overwhelm. But how did you manage that on your retreat?
Yeah, well, so there's a technical difference there. One isn't visualizing anything because you're just seeing, right? And these images just come to you. It it's a little bit, I remember, with the first one, the sense of wonderment, when all of a sudden these things would, from the darkness, then forms would begin to emerge, and then it would become very, very, very specific. One of the things that one has the opportunity to encounter in, the Buddhist context for dark retreat is going through the bardo process. And so this can be very, very intense. So it can feel as if we die, and then it can feel as if we're a bardo being. So, for lack of a better term, this disconnected consciousness that's moving through the bardo process. There are various opportunities where one can directly encounter the peaceful, semi-wrathful, and wrathful bardo deities. It's possible to be able to encounter beings that are in the bardo state. And some very fascinating, other kinds of experiences happen where it's not uncommon to fall asleep and have dreams. And so you're dreaming, and then you wake up and you open your eyes and the dream is still continuing, and then you cover your eyes and the dream is still happening, right? And so all of a sudden this kind of leads to a continuity of experience that is constant. And one of the kind of secondary effects of these kinds of retreats is that our days, for example, are split between daytime and nighttime. We have all of these kind of boxes, all of these kinds of ways in which we classify things. And in this kind of retreat, all of that gets kind of, blended into just one kind of experience that just goes as it does. And I think this is where also the training really comes in, because especially for a 49-day retreat, we're talking about 7 weeks of constantly seeing things, there being no differentiation between day and night. There's often no differentiation between dream experience and non-dream experience. So one finds themselves at times in these very kind of liminal states. And this too is a good example of a place where being firmly grounded in one's own meditation practice and an understanding of one's own mind and an understanding of the nature of the visual phenomenon that's arising is helpful to prevent one from experiencing problems as a result. Yeah, for freaking out. Now, my teacher, Dr. Nita, has always advised me, you can lock yourself into the retreat, but make sure you're the only person who is in charge of the lock, right? So that you can leave whenever you need, if you need. And I've never had the need to leave, but it has always been, a reassuring thing to know that I can leave, whenever I need, because it does get, it gets intense in a number of ways. Sometimes the nature of the visions become very intense. The bardo imagery can become intense. And so can some of our, defense mechanisms. We might all of a sudden find ourselves feeling like, I'm too busy to do this. Maybe I should leave, and so, just again, working through all of that as it comes. And, again, this being said, I just want to say that even though the imagery can be very intense at times, then other times it is the most beautiful kind of, experience as well.
Can you talk about the relationship to the bardo? Are there specific bardo practices that are done? Or, is it an explicit link, or is it just that you tend to have bardo experiences on dark retreat, just accidentally, not deliberately.
So it depends a little bit on the system one is engaging. I think you could say, on average, there are a variety of different kinds of gazes, we could say, that seem to curate or cause a kind of so in my experience, seem to cause a somewhat curated experience that will lead to bardo related imagery and bardo related experiences, and then also the post bardo experience, which is this very kind of dynamic experience of rigpa. So we could say that the instructions help cause an intended, I don't want to say intended, but cause a cycle of things to occur, and yet whatever will occur. This is kind of a little bit based on just like any other kind of meditation retreat, right? Like if one were to do like a shamatha or shine retreat, right? We could say, like, if we had to make an assumption about the retreat someone were going to go into, that there would be an increased quiescence of mind, an increased sense of settledness, right? However, how that is experienced by the meditator will be really, uniquely situated person by person. So that might be really kind of, up and down for some people. For others, it could just be this beautiful slope. There could be an obstacle right in the middle of the retreat that's really intense and rooted in a lot of klesha reactivity that one has to work through, and then one experiences this plateau of quiescence. And so I think we could say that the on average the instructions lead one through a bardo, sometimes very visceral bardo experience, sometimes a little bit more tangential, and then to this experience of rigpa afterwards. But again, what's alive in the mind of the practitioner A or B or C will be different.
Your mileage may vary. Depending on what's in your mileage may vary depending on what's in your...
Exactly. I mean, and what we could say karma, we could say well, a lot of things. But I have a friend who has done some dark retreats at the same time that I have. They live in a different continent, and we've checked in to kind of see, like, what was your experience like during this and that, and there's some places where there's some amazing parallels, that they're just like uncanny, and then there's some really specific things to their kind of klesha makeup, and for me, my klesha makeup, and but it's very, very fascinating. It's as if it reveals a kind of inner architecture for the practitioner. And I think this is the very interesting thing about engaging this kind of practice in a more systemic long-term way, where one does a lot of these or a number of them. It doesn't always have to be 49-day retreats, but shorter ones where one begins to kind of understand one's own kind of typology with respect to the bardo experience, and then with respect to the rigpa experience.
So we're obviously describing an advanced practice, but if newer practitioners are interested, is there a modified way to expose them to this? And this might tie into what you're doing with yangti, and maybe tell us about that.
Yeah. So right now I'm in the process of the initial stages of fundraising and all of this to start this retreat center, which in one way will continue along to advance and provide the traditional practice of this, so in 7-day settings and 49-day settings, and all the training needed to be able to approach these. practice of Trekcha, through the Yutuk Nintik Ati Yoga cycle, but also the Karma Nintik cycle and the Kunchuk Chidu Ati Yoga cycle. But then also, provide some shorter retreat possibilities for people, 1 day to 3 days, especially as a way of getting a better sense of, I guess, say, confronting the ideas we have about the nature of our mind and the ideas that we have about the nature of appearance. And so I think that these much shorter retreat opportunities, I think, are really dynamic places to be able to help augment people's practice in such a way as to be able to kind of jumpstart a kind of not just curiosity, but an understanding that the nature of appearance is much more dynamic and fluid and infused with awareness than we tend to assume. It also seems to reveal a lot about the dream state that I think is also very helpful for people. And then what I'm also really interested in is beginning to blend 7-day dark retreats. It could actually be anywhere from 3 to 7-day dark retreats for people who are interested in learning more about the bardo. So, again, I've trained as a chaplain and have done a lot of work in hospice and correctional settings, and on Hart Island. And what I'm really fascinated by is teaching and supporting people who want to engage in Vajrayana end-of-life practices like Poa, Bardo yoga, and the clear light yoga, and then the traditional Bardo teachings, and then offer a shorter dark retreat so that people can actually taste into this, so that what is being shared, so let's say there's a spiritual caregiver who wants to be able to help support people who are in either preparation for dying in perhaps a hospice context, or who want to be able to actually support consciousness in that bardo state. They can actually have lived experience of that, because I've found that has completely transformed the way I relate to it. Whereas, again, I love the bardo total. I love all the teachings around, Vajrayana, the Vajrayana approach to death and dying. However, I think we need to admit that at some point, much of this becomes like theoretical information that we're helping to offer others, which is much different than actually lived experience of having gone through the bardo several times, through this kind of experience. And then I'm also a little curious about offering this for people who are approaching the end of life, as a way of mitigating anxiety, spiritual pain, fear, etc. For people, obviously not as they're actively dying, but for somebody who knows, and we all are at some point going to die, that actually this could bring a tremendous amount of benefit for myself in that way.
Yeah, I think you and I previously discussed Lama Karma and his work with virtual reality meditation, and he is exploring that too, end of life experiences. And I think when we discussed this before, I was thinking of VR meditation and dark retreat as being very similar in that your environment is sort of controlled. But of course, with VR, you're being fed all the images, and in dark meditation, it's just the opposite. You're feeding the darkness. It's all coming from you.
Yeah, I mean, it's really fascinating. I still, Lama Karma reached out to me, and I hope to connect with them soon about getting a sense of that experience, because I've never experienced VR. Yeah, it's a really fascinating thing. And you'll find some instructions in the Bund tradition where there's also another, set of practices related to dark retreat, where there is, in some of the writings I've seen, a really nice description of the difference between visualization and the visions that happen. Yeah, at the end of the day, though, all visual experience, whether it's visualized or, natural arising visions, I guess you could say within the context of dark retreat, or moving through appearance, when you leave the office and you need to, go home, all of that visual experience and data is still experienced through the lens of the nature of mind and Rigpa. And so even though we could say that there may be technical differences, if one is practicing, something like Mahamudra or Trekcha, then it all becomes, essentially the same thing.
I'm going to do one last question before I get to the audience questions. And again, you can type those in the Q&A box. So I know equity issues are important to you, and I know you have a great deal of exposure to communities where the suffering is very acute, and Buddhism often suffers from accusations of elitism and privilege, but you must have seen firsthand what Buddhism can offer communities where suffering is just really is not abstract. The suffering is very present and concrete. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, of course. So, I worked for 5.5 years for New York City Department of Correction, but actually even before that, for 3.5 years before that, I offered meditation for primarily people in custody, but at one point for about 9 months, correction officers on Rikers. And I've seen, firsthand and experienced firsthand from being in relationship to people, whether they're people in custody, young adults, right, who for whatever reason, often reasons beyond people's control in terms of the societal factors that have, lack of access to food, education, family support, have, created the causes and conditions for people to end up, for example, on Rikers Island, and then finding themselves in a place of intense violence and noise and lack of freedom. It tends to exacerbate things. Also, amongst the incarcerated population in New York City, for example, it's estimated that at least 60% of the population suffers from mental illness, and that number isn't even including substance abuse, right? So it actually becomes quite a bit larger. So there's a tremendous amount of suffering. I have found that providing especially awareness-based practices as a way of mitigating the intensity of what is arising within oneself, and this ability to be able to kind of let go of reactivity in the moment can be quite helpful. And I would even go so far as to say, potentially therapeutic. I spent years offering this to the female identified population on Rikers Island, young adult male population, and maximum security facilities there too. And then when I was hired to be the chaplain for staff, then working with correction officers who work, at times, 16 to 20 hours a day in these facilities, and that has this way of kind of changing you over time. The stress, the long hours, the constant threat of violence, and working in the facilities through the COVID pandemic, also all the fear, the anxiety, etc. Actually, now at present, I'm doing a project with Brooklyn Defenders. So this group of public defenders that serve people from Brooklyn who are in the criminal justice system, supporting the public defenders who do this incredible work of doing their best to try and serve people who are working their way through a criminal justice system that is not particularly equitable, and supporting these folks around larger meaning making, connecting to their values through meditation, connecting to their body, understanding almost the symptomology of stress as it arises on an individual level. So there's so many applications. The thing about dharma, and the thing I really love about the Utognintik is that its orientation is closely aligned to the Sowa Rigpa, the Tibetan medical tradition. And in this way, dharma becomes a potential healing modality. And I'm particularly fascinated around being able to especially bring practices like Mahamudra and Dzogchen or Hatha Yoga to people, to help empower themselves to connect to a greater sense of resilience.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Okay, we have a little less than 10 minutes, so let's start going through our audience questions. How do we enroll in a retreat? Where is it held? What is the duration? I think that would vary. You spoke to a bit to that earlier.
Yeah, they can vary from, technically anywhere, even anywhere between 24 hours to 49 days. I'm in the process of developing, a place where one can do this. There are a few other places in North America that are connected to, different lineages of practices that do this. The primary thing, though, is really making sure that one has the preparation kind of under one's belt, or one is in the process of engaging meditation in order to be able to be properly prepared.
Right, and there was a question about precautions, which we saw.
Mm-hmm.
And then Jay asks, is it pointless to do this practice for a shorter period of time, less than 24 hours? Should we just wait until we can do a longer retreat?
No, it's not pointless at all. I think the thing is, meditation, right, and dark retreat practices in particular really are about getting to have a much better understanding of the nature of mind, the nature of awareness, the nature of appearance. And so even if one has 12 hours, and can either be in a darkened room, or it's not necessarily as optimal, but blindfolding oneself. The experience of being in darkness allows ourselves to get curious about the nature of all experience that occurs. So it's possible to shoot for a 49-day retreat and then for some reason either have to leave because it's a little destabilizing. I think the thing is if we can actually begin to kind of give ourselves this space to even get out of this kind of linear relationship to time, that will help too, right? So try to let a 12-hour retreat equal a 12-day retreat equal a 49-day retreat.
Right. Time is relative.
Yes.
You mentioned the lamas. You showed the text too were apprehensive. Why the secrecy? They cautioned against showing it to just anybody.
Yeah. So some of this is it's like a mixed bag. Some of it is just deep respect, right? So deep respect for the tradition or for the practice. And so often or sometimes in much more traditional contexts, people won't necessarily want to talk about things where it might not necessarily be the appropriate place to do that. And it's not out of controlling information as much as it is a deep veneration for we could say the power of the practices. And then though there are these kinds of things where sometimes practices like this can go to people's head, that kind of has the opposite effect, which is puffs up the ego. And so this is another reason sometimes why these are kind of held secretly, because if one is like, oh, look at me, I'm so great, and I can't believe, like, it's only Phil, like, why isn't the president of the United States, or some other, like, why isn't the Dalai Lama interviewing me? I've done all of this stuff. So that this is a good example of how this kind of retreat can puff somebody's ego up, and sometimes, like, in such incredible ways that the person is almost living in another world. And then there is this kind of warning that we find in Kang Chul's text in the Colophon about just how risky it can be to be in a situation where there's all this sensory deprivation, and maybe not necessarily either the right planning, or that the mental state of the person who is engaging in this isn't necessarily supportive of being in an environment of sensory deprivation. And so for this reason as well, in this instance, I mean, and maybe in all of them, it's a little bit of a protective secrecy. But this is, essentially to prevent harm for people who are not necessarily qualified for engaging in that practice.
Here's an important question along those lines. Is there any teacher guidance or support, occasional check-ins, dharma talks, or is it completely isolated?
This is a really good question.
This is a good question.
Yeah, and so typically, like with a 49-day retreat, one's teacher would come at least every 7 days. And so there's 7 sets of instructions. So every week you have to change the practice. And so typically, because you're in the dark, you can't have any texts or to read. So your Lama or teacher would, knock on the door, or, and then check in, how are you doing? And then give you the instruction for that set of 7 days. In my case, when I did my 49-day retreat, my teacher was in retreat themselves and in Europe. So I had to come up with a creative way of putting everything on a digital recorder, and every 7 days having the system of understanding when the 7 days was up, and then pressing the button and listening to the instruction and then turning it off. But it meant that I didn't have any access to my teacher for the whole 49 days, which was ended up working out okay. But is not optimal. Even in a 7-day retreat, and Dr. Nita and I have been in conversation about how to be able to properly support people. But even in a 7-day retreat, I would check in with people every day or 2 days, just to make sure that people are okay. But yeah, thank you. It's a really good good
question. Mary writes, did the forms look like Buddhist iconography or art, like the Thangka behind you, or were they more a more contemporary experience?
This is also a really great question. So for me, more Buddhist in terms of appearance, in terms of iconography. The funny thing is, though, is a lot of my interest in dharma is this crossover period when Marpa was alive. So when things were being transmitted, from India to Tibet. So actually, some of the imagery had a little bit more of like an Indic kind of presentation. Why I love this question is because I would love to theoretically have some people of other faith traditions engaging a short one of these to see what imagery comes up for them as well, because I think there's something to be curious about, this kind of like inner spiritual architecture piece.
Yeah. Well, we've reached the end of our hour. We have a lot of other great questions, and I hope we can save them, and maybe Justin can get to them another time, or we can.
Yeah, that would be great.
Format to answer them. I would like to do that. But Justin, thank you very much. This has been great.
Yeah, thank you, Phil. And I just want to let you know, I'm super happy it is you who is holding this with me. So rather
than the president. Yeah.
Exactly.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And if you'd like to watch this event again, we will be sending out a replay and a follow-up. I think there's some information about Justin in the chat, maybe, but we can also get that to you if you're looking for that. Reminder that Tricycle is a nonprofit and your support makes a difference. To make a donation, please visit tricycle.com/donate. And we hope to see you all again soon. And thank you again, Justin.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you all for being here. Take very good care.